As we look at the last few weeks of our study of intimate partner violence, here are a few ideas about practice, policy, and prevention in this field. First of all, we look at agency practices. One of the things that needs to be considered is that battered mothers have been isolated in large part from the community, and so oftentimes they have very few friends, few contacts, fewer long-term relationships, and fewer persons who listen to them. So this implies, first of all, that the person intervening with the victim would want to make sure that they do listen very closely to their concerns, but also work at trying to identify individuals who might be some support for the victim as she considers leaving the abuser. But stopping the abuser is only a first step. Helping the survivor heal is really the process after that. What types of social support help the victim? The type of support provided is crucial. Might it be a place to stay or support in contacting law enforcement, encouragement to get counseling, helping them find someone who can be a listening ear at times, all sorts of different ways that support can be provided. And each client will have a different area that is necessary. Helpful agency actions include having battered women exercise more control when working with workers in this area to begin with, because that control is something that they've been denied in their relationship. Improving shelter services by making sure that a comprehensive abuse history is taken, and screening for substance abuse is another step in improving services beyond what we typically see. Shelters will often screen for violence with women and will want to screen out women who have been arrested for IPV. However, it's important to consider that battered women who strike back are not truly female batterers, and some consideration should be given in distinguishing them from female batterers in general. Because battered women's energy levels have been sapped by the violence, oftentimes they have shied away from providing adequate parenting for their children and teaching them how to parent positively as a single parent or in the absence of the terror of the abuser, and to understand the children's reaction to exposure to IPV is something that is very important. Traditional supportive housing should be expanded to respond to allow women to avoid homelessness and help them to avoid having to return to their abusive partner. If you're providing services to an IPV victim or survivor, here are some considerations for counselors and topics to consider when setting up a treatment plan. First of all, clinical screening should screen all clients for male to female IPV really of all types, should screen for substance abuse and for symptoms of trauma. Once establishing a history of IPV with your client, some basic counseling goals ought to include how they define the meaning of their partner violence, if they understand the cause of it and the role it plays in their lives, and being able to recognize those things. Alcohol treatment to respond to the high number of IPV victims suffering from substance abuse is another area that needs to be given some consideration. If your organization doesn't provide substance abuse services specifically, a referral to an agency that does would be indicated. Remaking the victim's belief system is maybe the most important therapeutic work. Recognizing that male partner violence is not the norm, that women do have rights in relationships, and so on. One of the things that a counselor should be sure to cover is the discussion of the dangers in leaving the abuser. This is something that clients should be apprised of when they're leaving an abusive relationship, and safety planning is very critical in these situations. When initiating a relationship with an IPV victim, it's always important to address any immediate safety issues that the victim may have and make sure that the victim feels safe at the present time. Help the victim to develop a safety plan, perhaps determining whether or not they have access to a cell phone or a phone of their own. And we assume these days that victims always have their own phone, but that's often not the case in these situations. And so a worker may need to be creative in helping the potential victim to find other ways to connect with those services, perhaps using a friend's phone or a phone at work or a phone even at the grocery store down in the corner. These are the kinds of nuts and bolts issues that are important to cover with the victim. Also be sure that she has some idea of what to do before, during, and after any violent episode that might provide safety for herself and for other vulnerable members in the household. Again, I would refer you to the Peterson textbook for some excellent ideas about developing safety plans with victims, but some of the issues that they suggest would be to be sure that the victim or survivor is able to contact the local shelter and discuss ways to leave and places that she might go to keep herself and her children safe and alive. Does she have an extra set of house keys or car keys hidden somewhere in a safe place so she could leave quickly? Can she maintain some money and important essential papers and documents for herself and her kids in some safe place that she can access throughout the day? She might want to keep a change of clothes for each additional family member and herself, as well as any necessary medications and anything else that might not be duplicated easily, and keep that handy in case she needs to leave in a hurry. She should always keep a list of emergency phone numbers, identify a trustworthy friend or coworker that she can temporarily stay with if there's an emergency and a shelter's not available, and so on. Brain-based psychotherapy takes into consideration the brain's role in developing problem feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and in modifying them, and can often be helpful in working with survivors of IPV. Such interventions as cognitive behavioral therapy can be very useful in helping the victim to recover emotionally from these events. Whatever kind of treatment is implemented should be individualized to meet the specific need of your client because, as this slide suggests, one size does not fit all. Something that needs to be considered also is the fact that while the victim may have negative feelings about the abuser, the victim is also likely feeling attached and may be grieving the loss of the relationship and the hope for improvement in that relationship. Counselors oftentimes get very frustrated facilitating recovery of female victims because they don't recognize the fact that there's a positive side of the victim's relationships that she needs to process and that she's losing. Also, feelings of loneliness can become particularly strong for survivors and is one reason why battered women often return to their relationships or seek out other relationships that sometimes can be harmful. Likewise, this is true for male partners. Those that are dependent upon the victim, the survivor, oftentimes will find himself feeling driven towards violence because he recognizes that his partner may be getting ready to leave him. This is one of the reasons why the time when the victim is leaving the relationship can be particularly dangerous to her. Sometimes also, when one partner feels a need for more closeness than the other, frustration also can escalate into partner violence, and it's worth exploring the patterns of closeness, proximity, and distance in that relationship to help the victim understand how that relationship worked. Different types of coping styles for the battered women will result in different types of successes in help-seeking behavior. Problem-focused coping styles, that is, focusing upon what needs to be done and working to achieve them and overcoming the barriers that needs to happen to establish her independence, for instance, are much more successful than avoidant coping styles, those situations where an individual doesn't want to consider the problems that they are faced with. And as mentioned earlier, personal empowerment strategies are an essential component in recovery and should be a part of all work with IPV victims and survivors, helping that person to gain power and to take the action necessary to establish her independence and safety. Another area that is very sensitive sometimes, but is something that perhaps more in the later stages of interventions and counseling, is the area of forgiveness. And being able to work on that is something that can be a contributor to the person's health in the long run. In all cases, whenever policy is being made to assist IPV victims in your agency or in the community, victims should always be treated as experts when developing those policies. Of course, we know discrimination against women in political and legal systems is rampant, and it allows practices to undermine women's attempts at independence. Discrimination against women occurs in many other settings, including the college classroom, for instance. Housing is another area where discrimination is a problem. For instance, the eviction of tenants in government-sponsored housing oftentimes is possible when violence occurs. And not only is the perpetrator evicted, but then also the victim is evicted as well. The court systems oftentimes find themselves discriminating against females. Victims of violence oftentimes, for instance, are not awarded child support. Or, as we've talked about in other discussions, sometimes the batterers actually are able to gain custody of the children in custody proceedings following a separation. The courts complicate efforts of the victim to relocate to safety, for instance, feeling that fathers have a right to know where their children are. This is something that needs to be addressed very carefully with judges if you're working with cases involving intimate partner violence. The workplace is another area where discrimination occurs with women. Lower wages, as we know, that women experience in our society contribute to their dependence upon abusive males. It may force them into poverty when they leave. Corporations that do employ females should look at their policies regarding abused employees and dealing with those abused employees' needs, including such things as making sure that there's a system in place to offer protection from the abuser if an employee is a victim of IPV, and also to establish policies that guarantees the job when absenteeism results from victimization. A variety of services are offered by women's shelters, and economic skills development is one of those services that can help women meet employment and educational needs. And also, training unskilled males help them to pay support. This is probably not something that women's shelters are going to do, but this is just as a general policy for the community. And legislators should be lobbied to strengthen existing laws to protect women against sex-related discrimination. Welfare payments can sometimes increase the risk of battering for some women because of the regulations and because it doesn't offer a living wage. This oftentimes forces women back into the abusive relationship. If the woman is determined to stay out of the relationship, the welfare systems generally require the recipient to identify the father and to help the agency to locate the father. And this, of course, complicates any efforts that she may be making to protect her safety by staying in a location that he's not aware of. We should always approach abused mothers as supportive, not blaming them. And there are a lot of misguided policies and welfare programs out there, for instance, that fail to recognize the growing diversity of family structures and to establish their procedures around those new structures. Likewise, think tanks and organizations in a society such as the Heritage Foundation see marriage as a safe haven for poor women and for those seeking protection from violence. Hiring and training welfare workers is something that's very critical because many workers aren't aware of how to go about screening and identifying domestic violence in clients' lives. Most frequently, battered women seem to disclose to their healthcare providers more than any other professional group. Unfortunately, not all healthcare providers make good contact with their patients, and so it's important to ensure that a victim that you're working with does have a healthcare provider that she has confidence in. A number of physical and mental health care organizations now include a routine IPV screening as a part of their medical screening, and especially these screenings should watch for mild traumatic brain injuries. The JCAHO, the Joint Commission for Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, has mandated identification of battered women in the emergency room. CDC has also gone about gathering more evidence about domestic violence. But still, medical professionals need more training in order to be more effective in screening and referring IPV victims. And also how to avoid some of those responses that are experienced by the victims as being blaming and non-nurturing, such as distancing, victim blaming, questioning whether the symptoms are real, and so on. And also that the healthcare providers recognize those non-physical health repercussions of IPV, including depression, anxiety, PTSD, and so on. So overall, ideas for prevention strategies would include government and non-governmental organizations taking steps to prevent male to female IPV as might be appropriate within their own jurisdiction, in their own area of expertise. In our society, we need to target sexist, patriarchal, and hostile attitudes towards women. Another area that can be very helpful is in reaching out to college students who are often among the most vulnerable populations for violence, and college classes should require freshmen to attend violence prevention classes. And finally, a public awareness program that will enable potential victims to avoid victimization is something that's very critical, not only in general public education, but also in schools and other organizations that reach our young people as well. These are just some additional ideas about policies that might help overcome the problems of IPV in our society, and I hope that you find them useful in supplementing the readings that you've done in the last few weeks.